Hi, this is Dr. Christopher Perrin with another episode with The Christopher Perrin Show. Thank you for tuning in. In this particular episode, I'd like to talk about the importance of beauty when it comes to our classical schools and homeschools. I'd like to talk about embodying our education. Now, we know that education is a matter of communicating truth very effectively to students. Truth, goodness, and beauty are held up as transcendental ideals that we believe in and want to impart to our students and cultivate within them. As I consult with classical schools and sometimes homeschooling communities around the country, I often find myself talking more and more about the way we need to embody education. And therefore, I end up talking more about our five senses. And this is because many of us in the classical education renewal are rediscovering the importance of being embodied creatures. Yes, we have minds, but we have bodies. Our educational ideals, such as wisdom, virtue, and eloquence, they need to be seen, they need to be heard, but also smelled, tasted, and felt, because we have bodies, and truth is mediated through all five of our senses, and so is goodness, and so, of course, is beauty. So pardon this large generalization, but since the Enlightenment, the life of intellect, learning, and education has become increasingly text-centered. Now, I'm a great advocate of text. I believe in text. I believe in books, particularly the very best ones, the so-called great books. And I think we should read much more of them and talk much more about them. I do think, however, that too much focus on texts actually makes for dull schools and dull students. Some will object to this. Should not the written word be central? Are we not under siege by all manner of inane video images and cacophony? Is not our visual and sonic field just flooded with clutter and stuff? And is not Christ called the Logos? And does not this elevate the Word to the highest place? Well, yes and no. The Word and the text do deserve a privileged position. And yes, we are flooded with sonic and visual debris. Speech does set us above the animals and mark us as being made in the likeness of God. I believe that. Christians acknowledge that God has spoken through Scripture, a text, and that in these latter days He's spoken through His Son, the divine Word. So yes, the Word needs to be elevated. Still, should we not also note that Adam and Eve were placed in a garden and that Christ the Word became flesh? We have bodies, and Christ took on a body, and the body has five senses. Eve was able to see that the fruit was a delight to the eyes and good for food. Isn't it not safe to assume that the garden, if not all of it, all of the garden, was also a delight to the eyes? And we know that there must have been much there that was delicious to eat, as well as beautiful to behold. Christians consider humans to be infleshed souls, and that therefore the life of the body is delightful and good. In fact, as infleshed souls, most Christians consider the body and soul, or the mind, if you will, as two parts of one unified person. You are one person, and you have a material, animate, immaterial aspect or element. You have a body, you have a soul, and these two are fused in a harmony. And there's some mystery to this, isn't there? It means that our body is important for life and for the life of the mind, and vice versa. Now, the mystery of the mind-body relationship we'll have to just pass over at the moment. There's been a lot of writing about this, and there's differences of opinion. Where does, say, the soul end and the body begin, or vice versa? But we do have five senses. We do have bodies that enable us to know, learn, serve, and love. Why then do we pay so little attention to what will delight our eyes and ears? Hardly ever do we think about what we will smell, taste, and touch, at least when it comes to our schools. Now, maybe when dinner's coming, we're thinking about this, but how would smell, taste, and touch really have any significant place in our schools? Lesson plans and curricula are filled with references to what students will read, and that's so far so good. Very good, in fact. And of course, plans cover what they will write and perhaps speak. But what about the five senses? Is there a place for this in our curriculum planning and in the way we envision school, generally speaking? Well, try this as a thought experiment. Imagine creating a lesson plan or a curriculum that appeals exclusively to the sense of touch, smell, or taste. It's just a thought experiment. It might be impossible to really do this, but what would it be? What would it be like? We're not even sure what it could be like. Because we have to see everything. But what if it was a matter of touch? What if you were blind? Then what? You still have four senses. We could do so much more with touch, smell, and taste, but we scarcely know where to begin. Probably we would be wise to simply try to extend and deepen our engagement of sight and sound, right? Well, let's just do that. Let's just focus on sight and sound for a moment rather than smelling, tasting, touching. So let's try another thought experiment. Imagine going into a school for a day with a blindfold on. For an entire day, you visit a school, maybe a school that you've never been to before, but you heard that it was a remarkable classical school. What would you hope that you would hear if you couldn't see a thing? What would delight your ears to hear at this ideal classical school? What sounds? What music? What laughter? What kinds of conversations among teachers and among teachers and students and students themselves and parents? Is there any poetry? Are songs being sung? Are there any musical instruments being played? Are any songs sung spontaneously? What would be the sounds that would make you truly happy? And I've done this experiment with some staff training, and some interesting results often come. What might make you happy to hear? Imagine visiting a school and this time being unable to hear. Perhaps you have some of those noise-canceling headphones on. What would you see then if you can't hear anything that delights your eyes? What countenances, what expressions on faces, what art, what light, what arrangement? Do you see smiles? Do you see any animals? Is there a large, beautiful globe on wheels in a public space? Is the art displayed big or small, delightful, or is the art part of a mishmash of visual clutter? How are the children dressed? What are they doing with their bodies that indicates their own revelry and joy? So as you can see, I recommend doing a sense inventory, and not just with these two senses, seeing and hearing, but with all five senses, a five-sense inventory. What does each of your senses tell you about your school or your homeschool? What delights you? What would you love to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch? What would embody the ideals you hold up for classical learning? I think we need to think creatively about this and how we embody our ideals, and not merely talk about them. Of course, we do need to talk about them, but beyond talking about them, how can we embody them? And I think taking an inventory like the one I've described might help. Well, let's just note some sad facts. These are some realities that have become fairly mundane, but it's worth just noting them at this moment. Most schools, often due to circumstances that are hard to control or that they cannot control, most schools are ugly. By this I mean normal, because it is normal for our schools to be ugly, such that we don't even question it sometimes. Like we don't question using a red pen and the ABCDF marking system. It's been around for about 125 years. It's what was done to you. You do it to your kids. It's normal. It's hard to question it. Sometimes does a fish know it's in water? Do we know that we're in an ugly school? Does the emperor know that he has no clothes on? Our schools are ugly, but do we know it? Well, it's normal. In comparison to other institutions, our schools, more than any others, resemble the layout and organization of something like a factory floor or a prison, casement windows that do not open, polished cement floors, heavy doors, long hallways, industrial fluorescent lights, buzzers, keys. Visually, the classrooms are a clutter of calendars, class rules, number lines. word walls, maps which are always too small to use, art prints which are usually 8 by 11, always too small to see from the middle of the room even, and certainly from the back of the room, and often unrelated to each other or to any class theme. And then the standard obligatory class globe, always kept on a shelf like a knick-knack because it's too small to use, but cheap enough to buy for display, and it's usually covered in dust. The room is brightly lit by cheap overhead fluorescent lights. This all adds up to this: the school is ugly. We would not ever think of decorating our den or living room like what we call school, and it would much be better if we would reverse it and decorate our classrooms like home. We need to reverse our order of decor. We have evolved a way of doing school with primary colors, laminated maps, and number lines and word maps, and all kinds of visual aids that are actually practically helpful, but the end result is ugly. And I know the situation has something to do with money. We have a habit of doing schools cheaply because of money. And we call this good stewardship. I want to acknowledge that that's a real problem. I don't want to just pass over that. A lot of schools that are getting started, classical schools getting started, they are cash poor. They don't have a lot of money. So, Chris, what do you expect? But let me go on. But we generally try to get the best home, buy the best home we can afford when we can buy a home. And if we can't buy a home, we usually move into an apartment. And if you recall when you got started, when you were a young married couple, if that describes you, what did you do with that first apartment? Didn't you try to make it as beautiful as you could with the resources that you had? Didn't you want it to be a home? Well, why don't we make schools more like a home rather than schools as we have considered them to be? This does not mean that we have to tear down and rebuild our schools with marble and mahogany. Many teachers live in modest homes that they have made beautiful. We could, if we put our minds to it, beautify our schools, I think, in various ways, even with modest means. I think our difficulty is largely one of mindset. Classical educators have rightly majored in truth, but they've minored in beauty, if they've studied beauty at all. In the last 7 or 8 years, I think this is changing. Classical schools have kind of awakened to the fact that, we haven't paid attention to beauty. We haven't paid attention to the fact that we're embodied beings and that we can make even a humble school building, we can make it beautiful with modest resources, just like we did when we got that first apartment. So if I sound a bit severe, know that I'm being severe with myself because this has been my experience and thought too. Know as well that our aesthetic anemia is a culture-wide problem and that we're more or less just being carried along by the contemporary cultural tide. So in one sense, it's not our fault. This is what we have inherited. And so we have been kind of enculturated thinking that schools can look the way they do and that it's just the way it should be. Charlotte Mason challenges this too, by the way, in many places in the tradition. The monastic tradition does. But Mason said, schools should be like a home, and the art on the walls should be beautiful art, realistic art, not cartoons. There should be comfortable chairs. There should be a rug. There should be floor lamps. The windows should open. There should be curtains. What's the metaphor for school? More like home than any other institution that we know. I believe she's right. So let me close with a high note. There are schools and homeschools that are changing, that are recalling again that truth, goodness, and beauty are all in a dance together in harmony. And that we know truth even through beauty and we know beauty through truth, that these things are in this kind of interrelationship and that therefore our own study of great texts should lead us to creating beauty because the great tradition tells us so. And because of the interrelationship. And so there are a number of schools that have had the opportunity to either renovate or build, and there are a number of schools that are young and youthful that have had the opportunity, even with modest means, to make their schools look more like homes. It just so happens that the ACCS has produced this week. I'm speaking now in the winter of 2025. The classical difference, and this is called the beauty issue. And in the beauty issue, there's a lovely article by Tom Spencer about a number of schools that have emphasized beauty and wed beauty to truth. The Coram Deo School in Flower Mound is highlighted. It happens to be a school that I visited. Polly Dwyer is the headmaster there years ago. She and her team put together a plan and some finances to make the grammar school and then the rest of the school beautiful. And to visit that school, it is more like a home. It's part home, it's part museum, it's part garden, and it's part musical conservatory. Because all of these metaphors have been used to describe what classical education should be. What if your school was more like a museum? What if the art was curated? And what if every room was like a room in the museum? Of course, I'm speaking metaphorically, but that would lead you to think differently about how you would decorate and arrange everything in a school, whether it was a classroom in first grade or 12th grade. What if you thought of your school as a garden and the relationship between the indoors and the outdoors was in a kind of harmony? What might that do? Well, let me close with just a couple of other resources that might be of interest to you. John Skillen has written a book called Making School Beautiful. He's an emeritus professor of Renaissance literature. He knows art, and he's studied this over many years and written a lovely book about how schools could be made beautiful. It's published by Classical Academic Press, and I encourage you to take a look at that. David Clayton has written a book. He's a Christian who's really studied aesthetics and architecture. He's written a book called The Way of Beauty. And it's a remarkable book that will also help you if you're thinking, I want to make my school or homeschool beautiful. Take a look at those two resources. I'm sure you'll appreciate it. And take a look at the Classical Difference edition from the winter of 2025. Thank you for your kind attention, for listening or watching. This has been Christopher Perrin with The Christopher Perrin Show. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for watching or listening to The Christopher Perrin Show. And to do that, I can give you a coupon code that will give you 10% off on anything that you might care to order at classicalacademicpress.com. And the coupon code is simply CP Show. Thanks again for listening or watching.